Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Yes, good morning. Today we look at the railways. We've been ploughing billions into them, keeping them going even though there have been hardly any passengers.
Yes, railway companies by and large have not used the furloughing scheme. So most railway employees have retained full service throughout the pandemic. It's quite unusual in that regard.
So public money piled into a network that Maggie Thatcher had hoped would be paying its own way well before now. Well, that wasn't working even before the pandemic. And after the pandemic, the hope of profitable railways will be even more forlorn. So what should we be spending money on?
We're never going to take the strategic stuff away from government because that is its role to come up with the policy and the vision. But I really would like them to have one. You know, it would be great if there was a vision for this country, for what they wanted it to look like in 20 years.
Sir Michael Holden joins me today to talk about the plan for rail. Well, the fact that there actually isn't one, and he'd quite like there to be one, and we're still waiting for it. Plus, China steps in when share prices fall. Andrew Bailey admits inflation is now a risk. And we're getting our COVID numbers back under a bit more control. But look at what's happening in Italy. All that in the next half hour. And, oh yeah, was there anything interesting on TV last night? I don't know, I missed it. It's Tuesday, the 9th of March 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's The Business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Well, it is the worst royal crisis in 85 years, according to the front page of the Daily Mirror today. Yes, apparently it's worse than discovering that Prince Andrew has actually been having secret holidays with a sex-trafficking paedophile. So it's come to this, says the Daily Express. What have they done, says the Daily Mail. Palace in turmoil over Meghan's racism claim, says the Times. The Guardian, palace in crisis over devastating racism claim. Duchess has shown courage, says Biden in the Daily Telegraph. And the palace in crisis over racism allegations, says the Eye. Literally every front page. The Daily Star, our telly broke at 8:59 last night. Did we miss anything? Well, actually, you know, we missed it in our house because, ironically, we were sitting watching Suits on Netflix. So we were watching Meg and Gail, but in a slightly more interesting fashion rather than just having her talk about herself. But you know what? I'm going off Suits, actually. It's the same story every week. And it is a bit bitter. That New York bitterness, which, we could do with that. Thank God for the FT, though, the only paper that doesn't make it the front page lead. It's the third paragraph in their brief section. Their main story is Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, yesterday for the first time admitting that inflation might actually be a thing. He was speaking at the Resolution Foundation yesterday. He was saying basically that there is a risk that the recovery could be slower than hoped for, in which case they might still look at negative interest rates. But I don't think that's going to happen. But he also said, well, it could be faster and they might have to lift interest rates sooner if inflation picks up. So, look, there's more on this tomorrow because this is very much an emerging theme. A lot of investors are very worried about inflation. So we're going to talk about all of this with Paul Kavanagh from Patronus Partners tomorrow. He's going to be joining me. We'll talk about this whole inflation and rising interest rates and how quick it could happen tomorrow morning. So listen out for that. Look, when government bonds, the yield that you get or earn on government bonds, when they rise, what we've been seeing all around the world is the central bank buys them up to try and contain them. Without success, perhaps lately. But what about when that happens in shares? Because that seems to be, maybe not the central bank, but it seems to be what's happening in China. Since the middle of February, the CSI 300, the Shanghai Shenzhen Index, has fallen more than 14%. But overnight, mysteriously, quite a pickup. And this has happened a few times before. Just as the drop seemed to be accelerating, it's bounced back. It's up over 3% in just a few hours. Now, that could just be bargain hunters seeing that, you know, maybe it's bottoming out and trying to get in there. But the indicators are that it seems to be the Chinese government, through their various entities, have been buying them up. That's the story this morning. The Communist Party will entertain any direction in share movements so long as it's up, it seems. They are probably worried that if they don't step in, then people will bail out of shares and everyone's going to put their money into housing, which will give them a housing bubble, which is the last thing they want. It is very difficult, isn't it? Running a free market. They must be finding that. Well, everyone is finding that, really, to be honest. Look, encouraging numbers from the Office of National Statistics yesterday. In the week up to the 27th of February, they reckon just 0.3% of the population in the UK had COVID. And the peak, this was interesting, the peak was actually 1.9%. When do you think that was? Just after Christmas? No. Just before Christmas. It actually fell between Christmas and New Year and the weeks that followed. So all of that suggests that the lockdown that we had prior to Christmas just wasn't enough. It wasn't doing its job. But anyway, we are heading in the right direction now. In fact, some of the temporary hospitals that were set up are being closed down now, and vaccinations are going ahead. Look, India vaccinated 1.7 million people yesterday in a day. The US has set this target to do almost 1.5 million each day. In Europe, well, not so quick. And sadly, places like Italy are now seeing the infections rise. Are they going for another wave? They've just passed 100,000 deaths there. Obviously, not up to our world-class standard when it comes to people dying from COVID-19, when you look at it proportional to the population, although Italy isn't far off it. But in terms of infections, the average in Italy over the last 7 days is 20,400 infections a day compared to less than 12,000, middle of February. And we're seeing a slight pickup happening in Germany too. So I wouldn't be booking a European holiday just yet if I was you.
It's the business, making sense of it all.
With Phil Dobbie.
Now, let's take a date in this latest COVID-19 lockdown. 12th of February. It was a Friday. And these numbers are pretty similar to the days leading up to and since that day. The number of people using the tube on that day, 12th of February, was just 18% of the usual amount for that date in years gone by. The number of people using National Rail, 16% of the usual number. And, you know, I reckon that actually seems quite high because I see trains leaving my local railway station, you know, full in terms of the number of carriages, but empty in terms of the number of people. Only a few people on board, one per carriage usually. And the car park normally ran with cars. I would say at best it's probably about 10% full, normally full of commuters heading into London. Of course, rail usage basically collapsed in early March last year, quite a bit before the official lockdown. It fell to well below 10% of normal usage. And since then, it's never, ever got back up to half its usage prior. Even during summer, didn't even get close to reaching half of its prior usage. These are figures from the Office of National Statistics, their transport use during the coronavirus pandemic report. So what happens to these rail companies who must have been hemorrhaging money? Well, obviously the government has been stepping in with vast quantities of swag to keep them going. But what will rail travel look like after the pandemic? Well, Sir Michael Holden is an experienced executive in the rail industry. He was the Southern Regional Director of Network Rail. He was the Managing Director for Southeastern Trains, one of the franchises, and he's actually worked for a lot of companies. Got a long CV of jobs in the rail industry, and now runs a railway management consultancy specialising in giving strategic advice to railway companies. So I wonder, what advice are you offering to rail companies these days, Michael?
It's a £20 billion turnover industry, the Great British Railway Network, so excluding Northern Ireland. And of that, slightly more than half, 10.5 billion of the revenue comes through the fare box. And then there's obviously some retail and car parking revenue and so on. It makes it up to about 11.6 billion. The government had been subsidising the rail industry overall for best part of £7 billion a year, plus extra grant funding for enhancements. And what's happened in the last year is that they've had to basically put somewhere between 7 and 8 billion pounds at an annualised rate just to keep these nearly empty trains running.
So there's 7 billion in subsidy. Now we've added another 8 billion. So what's that? It's 15 billion out of what? Out of a 20 billion industry.
Yeah, it's completely unsustainable. So it's really it's a shocking indictment, really, of where we are, that there are so many trains running around nearly full length in many cases with so few people on them.
Yeah, well, I guess we still need them, don't we? And I guess the idea was, rather than furloughing people, we might as well keep them employed. If we're paying for them, we might as well keep them employed. They might as well carry on driving trains around the country.
Yes, railway companies by and large have not used the furloughing scheme. So most railway employees have retained full service throughout the pandemic. It's quite unusual in that regard. The Network Rail, you could argue, has been relatively lightly affected. It's taken the opportunity to try and do a lot more maintenance on the network in time that wouldn't have been available to it beforehand.
Right. Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? So less buses replacing trains on Sundays, maybe, for a few months after life returns to normal. But is life going to return to normal, do you think? Are we going to be using the trains as much?
You've just put your finger on it, actually, when you talk about buses replacing trains, because I'm arguing at the moment that the railway needs to reinvent itself for its future role. It's quite clear that we're not going to have a return to London commuting on the scale that we saw up until February of 2020. There are a variety of different views as to how fast and how much of that traffic will return. It's my view that it's unlikely to get materially above 70%, and it could well be as low as 60%. So bearing in mind that it's the London commuter traffic that produces the bulk of the rail industry's revenue, and you can see how damaging that will be to the finances of the industry as a whole. The other thing that's changing is we're not likely to see the same level of business travel that we did before the pandemic. So the days of people going to the other end of the country for a business meeting in the quantity that was happening before is not going to recur. So we're going to be faced with a lower level of commuting demand and a lower level of traditional business travel between cities. And taken together, those two things are extraordinarily bad news for railway finances.
Because the infrastructure is going to be the same. It's going to cost as much to maintain a railway. So you've got less revenue coming in and the same fixed
costs are relatively unchanged. I mean, you can make small reductions, but in terms of the fixed network size and cost, it's small beer, unfortunately.
So does that mean we have a beaching too in the wings? Then are we going to have to close down a lot of these lines?
That is a possibility, but at the moment it seems a remote one because the government seems very committed to rail. In fact, Boris Johnson has recently recommitted himself to all of HS2, including the right-hand part of the Y, the bit that takes it through the East Midlands and on up to Leeds. So I think beaching cuts were always politically very difficult, and I don't see them back on the agenda now. So that means, it brings me on to, I think, that the big thing for railways now is they have to reinvent themselves for a new future. What we are going to see is much bigger demand for leisure travel, visiting friends and relatives, day trips, holidays in the United Kingdom and so on. And the rail network needs to redesign itself to better meet those needs. At the moment, the fares structure and the ticketing system are somewhat outdated. Been a lot of attempts made to change them, but they're not really suitable for a leisure-based network, and one in which you want to move your demand away from people who have to use it because they've got no real alternative to one where people will actually want to use the trains because they're more attractive. So not only have you got to change the fares and the ticketing system, it also means you've got to change the approach to timetables. So trains need to run at times and on days of the week when people are going to want to use them most for leisure and not just traditionally on the weekday peaks. And this has implications for when the railway is going to be maintained, for example, and renewed, which traditionally is done at weekends.
Now it's going to be done on a Wednesday.
So that's not going to be possible in the future. So Network Rail has got to... But
is all that leisure travel really going to replace what we're going to lose in business travel? I wouldn't have thought so.
No. It won't replace it either in volume, but certainly not in yield. Because one of the things about it is that to compete with cars,
it's got to be cheaper than petrol.
It's got to be cheaper than the marginal cost of taking your car out of the garage. And at the moment, by and large, it isn't. So there's going to have to be, a fares revolution.
What you're describing, though, you're describing, well, there's going to be less travellers, perhaps more expensive rolling stock if you're having to jolly them up so that they're going to meet the leisure market. You've got lower ticket yields. You've got fewer people travelling, but you've still got the same overheads in terms of the infrastructure. That doesn't stack up. Does that mean you're going to have to be subsidising railways like we haven't done for decades?
It does mean that. It means a bigger subsidy from the Treasury to keep the industry afloat. But it also, paradoxically, means less requirement for enhancement spend, which is, in the current sort of scheme of things, tends to be grant funded by the government. rather than, as it used to be, sort of 20, 25 years ago, it was business case led. So when the railways were much closer to paying for themselves, if you wanted to, build a new station or speed up a junction or the speed at which trains run over a section of track to get journey times down, for example, you could develop a business case that would show how you recover the investment through increased fare box revenue. We can't do that sort of thing nowadays. So effectively, the government has taken over the direction of the industry and is now providing enhancement funding on a case-by-case basis. And that makes it pretty difficult.
So it's a broader cost-benefit analysis then, because it was always a nonsense, wasn't it, to look at it as an individual business case, because what you're talking about is taking traffic off the roads, for example, and reducing the effect of pollution, reducing the effects of congestion on the roads. So there's, the flow-on benefits to society from that, which was never factored into the business case for an individual rail operator, of course.
Well, I would argue that there has never been such a thing as an integrated transport strategy for this country. So there has been no mechanism by which you could evaluate whether a particular investment will be attractive or not in terms of modal shift. There has been no explicit government policy or strategy around modal shift in all my working time in the railways, which is best part of 50 years now. And there's no sign of one still. So in the most recent budget,
even though we are saying we want to get more traffic onto the trains, we're going to invest billions in building the HS2. There's no strategy that's saying, well, this is the reason behind that, it is a bit strange, isn't it?
It's utterly bizarre, to be honest. I mean, even in the most recent budget, we saw fuel duty frozen again for I don't know how many years running. But in the same week, rail fares, which are controlled by the Department for Transport, with the Treasury sitting behind them, of course, but rail fares were increased by more than the rate of inflation. Now, you tell me what other industry, faced with a collapse in its demand of 80%, would put its prices up.
Well, I mean,
there's something seriously wrong.
Yeah, well, where I am, it's £35 or more, £37 if you want to get into London, which a lot of people are doing every day. I guess and they save on season tickets a little bit, but actually the savings on season tickets when you take out a couple of weeks holiday a year are not actually that great. I mean, there's the ticketing is going to have to be looked at. I mean, not just for leisure travel, but the fact if people are going just a couple of days a week into London, then you're going to have to start introducing season tickets that are there for the spasmodic traveller rather than the person who's travelling in every day, aren't you?
Yes, and this crisis has forced the government's hand. I mean, there's been a requirement for fare and ticketing products reviews for a decade or so now. But the government has always found it too difficult to address the challenge. But now it's been forced into it. And it has announced that there will be a flexible season ticket product introduced in June. I don't know why it can't be done sooner than that, but we're still we still don't know what the details of that product are going to be like and what the level of discount is going to be like, how it's actually going to work, because a flexible season ticket that you say you use 2 or 3 days a week has to have some mechanism to prevent abuse. So that sounds like it should be based on tapping in and tapping out. Well, not every station has that facility at the moment. So it's not clear to me exactly what the product's going to be, that this flexible season ticket, and how it's going to be priced, and therefore how attractive it's going to be.
So with more government subsidy, does it make sense that these individual companies, and I'll try not to load this question too much, but running geographic local monopolies, often owned by foreign governments or foreign companies, does it make sense that we have these companies running these rail franchises, or should we renationalise?
Well, effectively, the railway network has been renationalised already. Network Rail is obviously already a nationalised entity, and the train companies are under direct contract with the Department for Transport. The Department for Transport is specifying the level of service, it's specifying the fares, it's taking on the revenue risk. Effectively, the private sector is solely operating as a contracted operator. And that's not the best use of the private sector. So you've still got all the complexities of the privatised industry layered on top of each other to allow for competition and to allow for open access operators and so on to come in and compete, but without most of the advantages. So we've got a structure of the industry that is far too complicated if it's all going to be operated in the public sector. So there's a need to work out if there's a proper place in the future for the private sector. And I would suggest if it's just going to be as a concession operator of something that's very tightly controlled from the government, the benefits of bringing the private sector in to do that are probably outweighed by the incremental cost and complexity that it creates.
Well, it sounds like everyone's trying to. I mean, we've had lots of failure. I mean, you've been involved in picking up where one's failed before, and it sounds like, there's been lots of failures. I think Arriva, which is a German company, they've been quite keen to bail out as well, haven't they? I mean, I don't think anyone who's in there actually is that keen to be there, are they?
I think, well, you need to compare what the situation was like up until last February and what's happened since. Nobody in their right mind would take on a revenue-bearing franchise at the moment. It's being impossible price.
For sure, but they were failing before, and I think Arriva were indicating even
some
before that.
franchisees failed, but I think you could argue that is a sign of the market working, that you would expect companies to fail who get their sums wrong. So as you said, I was involved in two of those, probably the most two well-known instances actually of Connex Southeastern, what became Southeastern Trains when I ran it, and what was National Express East Coast, which became East Coast when it was run again in the public sector.
But that was a monopoly, wasn't it? I mean, they are monopolies. They're geographic monopolies. If I want to get the train into London, there's only one railway station. There's only one rail company. I mean, so it's...
Well, you could argue that Southeastern Trains, which runs commuter trains into places like Victoria, Charing Cross, Cannon Street, Blackfriars, is largely a monopoly. But yes, it's only a monopoly of rail. There are other ways of making those journeys. But the second and far more importantly, East Coast, you could work from home.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that now we've been given that option, but up to this last year, that's really not been the choice. I mean, so it has been.
But it's very important to do now. And East Coast has never really been even a monopoly in its own right on rails, because the East Coast Main Line is the scene of the most intense open access competition in the whole of Great Britain. And if you live in somewhere like Doncaster or Newark, you benefit from that, and the fares from those places and the alternatives that are available on service.
Because you've got multiple operators operating on the same line in those places. You have,
yes. Not just at the moment, because the private sector ones are temporarily suspended because the government hasn't supported those, but they'll be back in due course.
So the Williams Review, a root and branch review of the railways in this country, was set up in September 2018. I think the original timetable was that they were going to come out with a white paper in 2019, and the reforms were going to start from last year. It was late with the white paper. It was obviously nothing to do with COVID, because it was expected to be out before then. Obviously, COVID has changed that whole review. I'm not quite sure whether that means what they did initially was a bit meaningless because the world's changed. But do we have any idea what's going to come out of it and when we're going to find out?
There was a draft of this thing ready before the whole COVID thing started. But I think it wasn't published at that time, probably because there wasn't an agreement within the whole of government as to what exactly ought to be in it. So the Treasury and the Department for Transport may have had different views. Now, the world has changed completely, and a number of the things that probably were going to be in the Williams Review have already happened, in the course of the pandemic. So the first thing that happened after the pandemic hit was that the government took direct control over all the franchises, because with the collapse in revenue from 100% to 5% in days, all of them would have gone bust within weeks. So they were put onto life support, which effectively meant that the government took direct control over all of them immediately. And so since then, they've been converted onto slightly longer term direct awards, but the government is still very much in the driving seat, and they're trying to move towards a concession style approach. By concession in a railway context, we mean one where the client carries the revenue risk rather than the operator. So where the operator carries the revenue risk is normally termed to be a franchise. So that there's no prospect of issuing any new franchises for the foreseeable future. And so the government is likely to take on some form of concession-based approach for the future. We don't yet know exactly what, because it hasn't been revealed to us.
But when you're saying the client, you're talking about the client being the government. So the government would be carrying the risk.
Yes, exactly.
Which again is crossing out the list of reasons why you'd have the private sector involved.
But probably the more significant part of the Williams/Shapps review, when it eventually comes out, will be how the industry is to be directed. Because at the moment there is a vacuum of leadership, because the decisions are all being taken inside government by people who are pretty busy dealing with stuff elsewhere. And there's not a lot of leadership being provided into the rail industry, with all of the big organisations effectively just doing what they're being told to do.
Well, Keith Williams, who led that review, he was talking at an industry event recently, I think last month, and he was pointing to how airlines have responded to the disruptive events in the past through consolidation, more competition, and greater emphasis on customer engagement. Now, can that really be replicated in the rail industry? He seems to think so, but I mean, but there's no competition. That's the thing. I mean, there's lots of airlines flying out of an airport, but if I want to get the train to London, as we said, I've only got one choice. And as you said, you can either choose not to go or walk. There are your alternatives. So that is a bit like saying there's only one supermarket and I can either use it or starve.
But he's exactly right, Phil, that airlines and coach companies, for that matter, have a commercial imperative which drives their behaviour. So they've been very good at reducing their cost base during the crisis by pretty much, as much reduction in service as they can, standing staff down, taking jets off lease and so on. And the coach game have been doing the same. The railway industry, by comparison, has maintained much closer to a full cost model.
Well, that's because you said because the government's told them.
Exactly, the government's picking up the tab. So I would much prefer that we find a way in the future of getting back the commercial imperative in the railways, so that there is actually some real drive to, because unless we earn back or win back the customers, the future is bleak, because we've got an industry that's costing a fortune and is generating very little income. And that is unsustainable.
So you talked about coordination and having a plan across multiple forms of transport. You can't put all that into one body, but if you had one body that was looking after rail with someone smart at the head of it, and helping to coordinate the rail side of that, and making the argument about how to drive traffic off the roads and onto the trains, and where that needs to happen, where the greatest opportunity is. Maybe doing it in regular contact with the person who's doing the same thing for the roads and for air. Then you do start to get towards several bodies working together on a policy, don't you? But you can't do that if you've got loads of different rail franchises. So do we need to go back to just having one big?
No, I don't think that's true. I think you can do it. I mean, the aviation model works pretty well, actually. You've got a regulator in the CAA, and then you've got airports and airlines structured, they're vertically separate. So we don't have vertical integration in the airline business. So there's no particular need why the railway needs to have a different approach. The thing that's really different in the railways is the lack of commercial imperative, because the revenue gain through the fare box isn't covering the costs and paying for it all. All the time you've got the Treasury shoveling cash into the industry and burning it like it is, the decisions are not being made correctly.
But will you ever get to the stage where it could be commercially viable, where the railways can exist without the government doing that? So as long as they're always doing it a little bit, there's always going to be that question of, well, can we have some more?
Yes. The tragedy is it was moving in that direction for quite some time, probably up until the last 15 years. I think costs have exploded since Network Rail took over from Railtrack. Franchising probably ran out of steam, and they found they couldn't find fresh ways to reduce costs and drive revenue. All the time, the railway industry is being propped up by demand growth. And the name of the game was how to provide additional capacity to squeeze people onto the network. But it's all completely, fundamentally changed in the last year. And a new model has yet to evolve.
Well, we'll see what this report comes out with. I mean, maybe the answer is that, well, okay, you've got to run on a commercially viable basis and pitch for government money, and you can make a business case that steps outside the realm of the railways. If your business case means you can get support because you're going to help reduce pollution on the M25 or on the M6 or whatever, or reduce hours of congestion on the M6, then you can get government support for that. And then you get a model there that is a cost-benefit analysis that helps you to get the money to support the financial operation of your business.
Yeah, I think you're right, Phil. I mean, we're never going to take the strategic stuff away from government, because that is its role to come up with the policy and the vision. But I really would like them to have one. It would be great if there was a vision for this country, for what they wanted it to look like in 20 years, and then what role transport might provide within that vision. So what provision, what role does rail play, or transport more generally, in economic development, in social cohesion, or, what is it for? And then once you've identified that whole of transport vision, what role would you like rail to play within that? So all that kind of stuff is for government to do. And then I would quite like the getting on with the doing of it to be taken out of government and put into some sort of agency which takes its strategic directive from the government and has a dollop of money to spend, but is left to get on with the details of how you operationalise that. For itself, with as little political intervention as is possible. I might be asking for the impossible here, but that's what it would much better run like that than how we have it now.
Doesn't sound too much to ask to me. Look, my ambition, my strategic vision for the next year is to get out more. I'm sure yours is the same, whether it's on the train or however it is. Just I need to get out. Good to talk, Michael. Anyway, it's been an illuminating half hour. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome.
And that's it for today. If you want to make sure you never miss an episode of It's the Business, then subscribe wherever you normally get your podcast from, or you can go to itsthebusiness.co.uk. If there's something you'd like us to cover, by the way, you can send me an email. phil@itsthe.business is the email address. And look, we're always looking for ideas for guests or for topics. So do that and make sure your friends are listening as well. That's it for today, though. Back again, Paul Kavanagh. Joining me tomorrow, we're going to look at inflation and when are interest rates going to rise. That's tomorrow morning. See you then.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthe.business or wherever good podcasts